What if I told you that everything you learned in school about the origins of human civilization might actually be off by thousands of years?
I mean, it sounds completely absurd, right? It sounds like the premise of a cheap science fiction novel.
Totally.
The idea that a foundational piece of human history could just be, misplaced. But when you start looking at the intersection of orbital satellite data, isotopic chemistry, and ancient genetics, that is exactly what we are confronting today.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are jumping into a seriously mind-bending topic today.
Yeah, we are.
We're looking at the Saraswati River civilization, and we are pulling from a phenomenal set of research materials today. Specifically, we're using the detailed transcripts from Swami Vivekananda Tamil.
Right.
And these transcripts, they just completely deconstruct the history, the ancient literature, and the cutting-edge modern science behind this ancient world.
It really is a masterclass in cross-disciplinary science. For a long time, the study of ancient texts and the hard sciences, they operated in completely different silos.
Oh, absolutely. Historians read the poems and geologists looked at the rocks, and they just never really talked to each other.
Exactly. But our mission today for you, the listener, is to take you on a massive detective journey. We aren't just recounting dates and locations.
No, we're going to unpack how ancient poetry, modern space technology, and DNA extraction all perfectly align. They align to solve one of the greatest geographical mysteries of the ancient world.
And what makes this topic so incredible is that we are basically using modern physics to peer review ancient mythology.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really understand the science, we first have to understand the legend that the science is actually testing.
Right, the textual echoes.
Yeah. We have to go back to the earliest layers of ancient Indian texts. Where do we even first hear the name Saraswati?
So you find it deeply embedded in the Rig Veda, which is one of the oldest known texts in any Indo-European language.
Right.
But what immediately stands out when you analyze the Sanskrit is that the text doesn't treat the Saraswati as just a topographical feature.
No, not at all.
It's not just a landmark or, a convenient place to water your cattle. They call it a Mahanadi, a great river.
It's elevated way beyond that. When you read the specific verses, and we have several translated right here in front of us, the reverence is just absolute. Let's look at Mandala 2, Sukta 41, verse 16.
Okay, yeah.
It directly addresses the Saraswati as Ambitami, Naditame, Davitame.
And what's fascinating here is the linguistic breakdown of those three words. It's the cornerstone of this whole mystery.
Right.
So Ambitame translates to best of mothers.
Yeah.
Naditame means best of rivers. And Davitame means best of goddesses.
Calling it the best of rivers, that's just straightforward geography. But best of mothers and best of goddesses, that is an astonishing level of devotion for running water.
It really is.
And they didn't just view it as a nurturing mother, they viewed it as an unstoppable force. There's another verse here, Mandala 7, Sukta 95, verse 2, and it contains the phrase, Giri Asamudra.
Which means from the mountain to the sea.
Exactly. It explicitly maps the flow of this river, unobstructed from the peaks of the Himalayas all the way down into the Arabian Sea.
And then you have Mandala 6, Sukta 61, verse 2, which describes the river's sheer kinetic energy.
Yes, the translations describe this river breaking mountain peaks with its waves.
Right.
When I was reading this, the image that kept coming to mind was an elephant just casually smashing its way through a dense jungle.
Well, that's a great analogy.
It's just this raw, terrifying, unstoppable momentum, It's easy to dismiss ancient texts as exaggeration. But looking at these specific descriptions, what is the text actually trying to tell us about the geography?
Well, this brings us to a fundamental rule of human anthropology. When you live in an ancient world, the environment dictates your entire reality.
Right, you don't have grocery stores or indoor plumbing.
Exactly. So calling a river a mother isn't just a spiritual metaphor. It is a statement of absolute existential dependence.
Because it's giving you life.
Right. A massive perennial river, one fueled by glacial melt from the Himalayas, rather than just the seasonal rains. It provides a continuous, predictable supply of water year-round.
It completely insulates you from the chaos of the weather. If the monsoon fails one year, a rain-fed river dries up and you starve.
Yeah, you're dead.
But if your river is fed by thousands of square miles of glacial ice melting in the summer sun, your water supply is practically guaranteed.
And that hydrological reliability gives an ancient society the most precious commodity in human history.
Which is?
Caloric surplus, food security.
Oh, right. Let's hover on that concept of surplus for a second because it fundamentally changes the trajectory of a species.
It really does.
If I'm an early farmer and I'm entirely dependent on unpredictable rain, my entire cognitive bandwidth is consumed by survival. Will the crops grow? Will my family eat? I am just constantly in a state of stress.
But the moment a massive glacial river guarantees your harvest, that stress just evaporates. You suddenly have leisure time.
Wow, yeah. I never thought about it like that.
This is exactly why the Saraswati is worshipped profoundly as the goddess of knowledge. The river literally gave its people the time to think.
Because they weren't just scraping by.
Exactly. When people aren't constantly struggling to survive day by day, they develop complex philosophy. They study the movement of the stars. They develop mathematics.
They compose intricate, mathematically structured chants and mantras.
Yes. The leap from subsistence farming to high-level intellectual pursuit, it requires a massive, stable energy source. And the Saraswati provided exactly that.
That is such a brilliant way to frame it. The water feeds the crops feed the people, and the surplus feeds the mind.
Precisely.
And if a river is powerful enough to support year-round farming of diverse crops, things like wheat, barley, cotton, and mustard, it isn't just going to spawn a few philosophers meditating on the riverbanks.
No, not at all.
It is going to trigger an absolute explosion of population. It's going to spawn sprawling, highly organized cities, which really brings us to the physical reality of the megalopolis that actually grew along these banks.
Yeah, when we look at the excavation data from this region, the scale of urbanization forces a complete rewrite of our conventional ancient history.
So we have the motivation for a civilization, this incredible food surplus. But a surplus doesn't automatically equal an empire or a cohesive civilization, right?
You still have to organize it.
Exactly. How did they project that stability across the landscape? Because the geographical footprint we're talking about here is staggering.
It's massive.
When we think of the cradles of civilization, for you listening, your immediate reflex is probably to think of ancient Egypt along the Nile, or Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates.
Both of which were geographically pretty constrained.
Yeah.
But the civilization sustained by this river network was vastly larger than contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia.
Which is just crazy to think about.
We are talking about a territory that today encompasses eastern Afghanistan, Pakistan, the modern Indian states of Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan, Gujarat, and western UP.
It stretched from the foothills of the Himalayas out west to Balochistan, down south to the Arabian Sea, and east toward the Ganga-Yamuna plains. It's a mind-boggling amount of real estate.
It is. And we must be clear here. We aren't just talking about a loose affiliation of scattered primitive villages.
No, these were real cities.
Exactly. We are looking at an interconnected network of highly advanced urban centers thriving roughly 5,000 years ago.
The urban planning data from cities like Rakhigarhi and Kalibangan absolutely blew my mind when I was reading the sources.
Oh, it's incredible.
Walk us through the infrastructure here, because it genuinely rivals things built thousands of years later.
So the defining characteristic of these cities is an obsessive mastery of public sanitation and civil engineering.
Sanitation, really?
Yeah. We are looking at urban environments that featured covered subterranean drainage systems lining the streets. They had individual soak pits for homes and intricate filtration systems to separate solid waste from wastewater.
We are talking about covered municipal sewers in roughly 3000 BCE. To put that in perspective for you, there were major European capitals in the 1800s, literally almost 5,000 years later, that still had raw sewage running openly through the streets, causing massive cholera outbreaks.
Exactly.
But these people understood the foundational requirement for public health in a dense urban environment from the very beginning.
It requires a level of civic foresight that is incredibly rare.
Yeah.
You don't build underground covered drains by accident,
Right, that takes massive planning.
You build them because you have a society that values collective hygiene and long-term infrastructure.
Yeah.
But what is perhaps even more remarkable than the drains is the sheer uncompromising standardization of their building materials.
Yes. Here's where it gets really interesting. The bricks. Every time you dig into these sites, you find baked bricks manufactured in a universally precise ratio, 1 to 2 to 4.
Height, width, length, 1, 2, 4.
Let's really think about the mechanics of that. Why that specific ratio?
Well, from an engineering standpoint, a 1 to 2 to 4 ratio is structurally ideal. Yeah, it allows for perfectly interlocking masonry. which prevents vertical shear lines from forming in the walls. It creates incredible stability.
It's basically the ancient equivalent of the modern shipping container.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right, because before the shipping container, global trade was a chaotic mess of different sized boxes and barrels. But the moment the entire world agreed on a single standardized dimension for a steel box, global logistics was revolutionized.
Exactly.
These people did that with bricks 5,000 years ago.
And the logistical network required to achieve that is what's truly astonishing.
Exactly. You have a civilization spread over a territory larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined.
Right.
They don't have the internet. They don't have a centralized postal service or telegraphs. How on earth do a brickmaker in Gujarat and a brickmaker hundreds of miles away in Haryana end up producing the exact same standardized structural unit?
What's fascinating here is what that implies about their administrative system.
Oh.
Typically, when we see strict standardization across massive geographic areas in the ancient world, it's the result of a brutal, centralized empire.
Like a massive military authority imposing its will from the top down.
Exactly. Like Rome building its roads, for example.
Right, with the Roman legions forcing everyone into line.
Precisely. But here's the great anomaly of this civilization. We find basically no evidence of a centralized, coercive military empire.
Which is so strange.
The 1 to 2 to 4 brick ratio implies a shared educational system, shared mathematics, and a deeply ingrained cultural consensus, rather than an imperial mandate.
And that standardization applied to their economy too, didn't it?
It did. Their weights and measures used for trade were perfectly cubical stones, and they all operated in strict multiples of 16, 32, 64, and so on.
Which tells us they were a thriving, highly sophisticated commercial hub.
Yeah, they weren't isolated at all. They were actively trading with Mesopotamia, Persia, and Oman. They utilized the river as a massive superhighway, shipping high-value exported goods like their famously intricate carnelian bead jewelry and high-quality cotton down to the Arabian Sea via boat.
And those cubical weights, those multiples of 16, were the mechanism for that trade.
Standardized weights are the ancient equivalent of a verified digital transaction on a blockchain today.
Oh, I like that.
They create a trustless system. If the weights are universally standardized and regulated, a merchant from Mesopotamia knows exactly what he's getting when he trades with a merchant from Calibangan.
Right.
It prevents fraud, it greases the wheels of commerce, and it builds immense regional wealth.
Which brings up a massive question. You have a society that accumulates immense regional wealth. They build massive cities with world-class sanitation. They dominate regional trade. Historically speaking, what happens next?
Well, historically, a society with that much wealth immediately builds a massive military apparatus.
Oh.
They build walls to keep jealous neighbors out, and they forge weapons to go conquer more territory. Wealth and warfare are usually intrinsically linked.
But I want to play devil's advocate here because the archaeological record of the civilization is so weird. When archaeologists dig through these massive cities, they find an abundance of children's toys.
Lots of toys.
Beautiful art and intricate jewelry. But they almost never find weapons.
It is a staggering anomaly.
Is it possible we are just missing the weapons? Like maybe they used organic materials like hardened wood or bone that just rotted away over 5,000 years, leaving a false impression of a pacifist utopia?
It's a fair question, it really is. But we have to look at the holistic archaeological picture. It isn't just a lack of bronze or copper swords.
Okay.
We also don't find massive defensive fortifications designed to withstand organized sieges. Furthermore, when you look at the art of contemporary civilizations like the Assyrians or the Egyptians, their murals and statues obsessively glorify war, conquest, and the smiting of enemies.
Right, it's all chariots running people over and pharaohs holding prisoners by the hair.
Exactly. But in the artwork and seals found along the Saraswati basin, that militaristic glorification is entirely absent.
What do they depict instead?
The focus is on nature, animals, geometry, and daily life. It strongly suggests a deeply peaceful society.
Wow.
Their influence was spread through commerce, culture, and standardized trust, rather than through the edge of a blade. They figured out how to generate wealth without needing to violently extract it from others.
And part of that wealth generation was their absolute mastery of their environment. At the site of Calibangan, archaeologists actually excavated an ancient, preserved, plowed field.
Yes.
And the furrows in the earth prove they were practicing double cropping. They had the geometric and agricultural knowledge to grow 2 different crops in the exact same field simultaneously.
Right, maximizing their caloric yield without exhausting the soil.
It's a stunning picture of a civilization operating at the absolute peak of its potential. A peaceful, mathematically brilliant, highly standardized megalopolis sitting on the banks of a roaring, mound-fed super river.
It really is incredible.
Okay. But this brings us to the great geographical paradox.
The big mystery.
But that drives this whole investigation. If you pull up a satellite map of northwest India today, the Rajasthan region, the Thar area, there is no river.
No.
There are no sprawling ports. It is dry, arid, and sand-swept. It is a harsh desert environment. So, where did the river go? And frankly, how do we know it wasn't just a collective cultural hallucination? How do we know this river was really there?
This is where we transition from ancient poetry and archaeology into the realm of modern physics and orbital mechanics. To find a ghost river, you need to look beneath the surface.
And to look beneath the surface, you need a very specific vantage point. The research details the involvement of major space agencies, specifically the Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO, and NASA.
Right.
What exactly did they do? Because you can't just point a regular camera at a desert and see a buried river.
No, optical cameras only show you the sand. You have to use something called synthetic aperture radar, or SAR.
SAR, okay.
These are satellites equipped with radar instruments that beam microwave pulses down to the Earth.
How does that help us see through sand, though?
It relies on the dielectric properties of the materials on the ground. Extremely dry, porous sand is basically transparent to certain microwave frequencies.
Oh, wow.
The radar pulse penetrates right through the top layers of the desert dunes. But when the microwave pulse hits bedrock, or more importantly, when it hits the dense, moisture-retaining clay and gravel of an ancient, buried river channel, the signal bounces back to the satellite.
It's like giving the desert an X-ray or like a medical ultrasound.
That's a perfect analogy. The satellites are measuring the subsurface density. And when ISR and NASA scientists compiled this radar data over the Thar Desert, Haryana, and Rajasthan, an unmistakable, continuous geological scar emerged beneath the sand.
They found the ghost river.
They found massive buried paleochannels. A paleochannel is simply the remnant of an inactive river or stream that has been filled in or buried by younger sediment.
Okay.
And the path of these buried channels perfectly traced a cohesive 1,500-kilometer route.
And let me guess where it starts and ends.
From the foothills of the Himalayas, winding through the plains, all the way down to the Rann of Kutch and the Arabian Sea.
Just like the Rig Veda said, Giri Asamuja, from the mountain to the sea. The orbital radar is perfectly corroborating a 5,000-year-old Sanskrit hymn. That is just astonishing to me.
And what's fascinating is that the scientists confirmed these paleochannels aren't completely dead.
What do you mean?
They discovered that substantial reserves of groundwater still flow slowly beneath these dry beds today. The river didn't entirely vanish. It was buried alive. It retreated underground.
Okay, I have to push back a little here just to make sure the science is completely bulletproof. We have radar pictures from space showing a buried riverbed. But a riverbed could be formed by anything, right? What if there was just a freak 100-year flood from an unusually bad monsoon season a few millennia ago?
Like a temporary flash flood.
Yeah. It carved a channel and then dried up. How do we definitively prove that this paleo channel was the roaring, perennial, glacier-fed beast that the Rig Veda describes?
That is the exact question geologists had to answer. And to do it, they couldn't just look from space. They had to get their hands dirty.
Okay.
Scientists from the Physical Research Laboratory in Ahmedabad and the Indian Institutes of Technology, the IITs, conducted deep drilling operations into these buried paleochannels. They had to extract the sand and sediment trapped deep inside.
And what are they looking for in the sand?
They're looking for a chemical fingerprint. This involves a process called isotope analysis, specifically looking at strontium and neodymium isotopes.
Okay, let's break that down for the listener because the mechanism here is fascinating. How does a grain of sand have a fingerprint?
Well, sand is just pulverized rock. And depending on where a rock is formed on Earth, it contains different ratios of radioactive isotopes that decay at very specific rates.
So they act like a timer or a signature.
Exactly. The rocks in the high Himalayas, the higher Himalayan crystalline series, have a completely different isotopic signature compared to the local rocks in the Ara Valley mountain range closer to the desert.
So if the river was just a local monsoon stream, the sand in its bed should match the local rocks.
Exactly. You put the extracted sand into a mass spectrometer. which is a highly advanced machine that literally weighs individual atoms to determine their isotopic ratios.
That's incredible technology.
It is. And when the scientists analyzed the sand from deep beneath the Thar Desert, the results were definitive. The isotopic fingerprint did not match the local Ara Valley rocks. It didn't match sand created by seasonal monsoon runoff.
Let me guess. It matched the Himalayas.
It was a perfect match for the specific geology of the high Himalayas. The isotopes proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the crushing force of a massive glacier-fed river carried pulverized mountain rock thousands of miles across the plains to the sea. It was a perennial beast, exactly like the Ganges or the Brahmaputra are today.
And we can put a timestamp on this activity too, right?
We can, because the river doesn't just carry sand, it carries organic matter, bits of wood, shells, biological debris.
Okay.
By extracting this organic material from the paleochannels and subjecting it to radioactive carbon dating, scientists can measure the decay of carbon-14 to determine exactly when that river was actively flowing and depositing material.
And the carbon dating proves that this river flowed mightily from roughly 7,000 BCE to about 2,500 BCE.
Let's contextualize that timeline.
Yeah.
7,000 BCE to 2,500 BCE. That is 4,500 years of a thriving, hyper-stable hydrological ecosystem.
To put that in perspective for you listening, the time elapsed between the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza and you listening to this deep dive today is roughly 4,500 years.
Yeah.
The Saraswati River supported a sprawling, mathematically advanced civilization for an entire ancient Egypt to modern-day time span before it even began to falter.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the profound implication here is that we are witnessing the ultimate convergence of disciplines.
Yeah.
Modern physics, mass spectrometry, isotopic fingerprints, and radioactive decay, and modern space technology. SAR radar bouncing off subterranean bedrock are effectively validating the ancient poetry of the Rig Veda. The Mahanati, the Great River, was absolutely real.
But this scientific victory creates a massive problem for historians.
It really does.
If the satellite data and the isotopic chemistry prove the river was real, and we know exactly where it flowed, we're forced to reevaluate the entire map of ancient archaeological sites.
Right.
And when you overlay the archaeological map onto the satellite map, it completely upends our fundamental understanding of ancient Indian history.
It triggers a complete academic paradigm shift. For nearly a century, history textbooks around the world have taught us about the Indus Valley civilization.
Right. That is exactly what I was taught in school. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, the Indus Valley.
But that naming convention was a result of a historical accident, basically a sampling bias.
How so?
In the 1920s, when archaeologists first started making these massive discoveries, they found Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. These cities happen to be located along the Indus River system.
Okay.
The Saraswati, at that time, was completely invisible, buried under the desert. So naturally, they assumed the Indus River was the center of this world, and they named the entire civilization after it.
But the data tells a completely different story now.
A radically different story. When modern archaeologists mapped all the known sites of this civilization, and there are thousands of them now against the newly discovered ISRO satellite maps of the buried Saraswati River, the visual is undeniable.
What does it look like?
Roughly 75% of the known settlements, about 1,100 out of roughly 1,500 sites, are clustered not along the Indus, but strictly along the dried-up banks of the Saraswati Paleochannel.
So we named an entire civilization after the wrong river.
We did.
The center of gravity, the absolute heartland of this entire culture, was the Saraswati Basin. It's almost like if archaeologists 5,000 years from now found a few ruins in Nevada, named the whole American empire the Nevada Desert Civilization, and completely missed the massive megalopolis sitting on the Mississippi River.
That is a perfect analogy. The historical naming convention lagged decades behind the actual geographic reality. And it isn't just the geography that's shifting, the timeline is getting pushed dramatically further back into antiquity.
Let's talk about those dates, because initially the assumption was that this civilization flourished around 2,500 BCE.
That was the conservative estimate based on the top layers of excavation. But as archaeologists dig deeper into sites along the Saraswati, specifically at places like Rakhigarhi and Pirana, they keep finding older and older layers of continuous unbroken habitation.
Right.
Stratigraphy, the layering of the soil and artifacts, pushes the foundational origins of this organized civilization all the way back to 7,500 BCE.
7,500 BCE. That is astonishingly early for that level of organized settlement. But the geographical and chronological shifts are really just the setup for what is arguably the biggest bombshell in modern archaeology.
Oh, absolutely.
The 2019 DNA study.
This is where the science gets incredibly intimate. In 2019, a major, highly anticipated genetic study was published based on skeletal remains excavated from the Rocky Gardi site.
Wow.
These are the actual people who built the covered drains, standardized the bricks, and lived along the Saraswati.
But getting DNA out of ancient bones is notoriously difficult, especially in the climate of Northwest India, right?
Extremely difficult.
It's hot, it's humid, there are monsoons. Heat and moisture absolutely destroy DNA. How do they even get a viable sample from something 5,000 years old?
It was an incredible feat of genetic engineering. Standard bones degrade too quickly. The scientists had to target a very specific part of the skeleton, the petrous bone.
The petrous bone, where is that?
It's a tiny, incredibly dense, pyramid-shaped bone located at the base of the skull, right behind the inner ear. Because it is so dense, it acts like a biological vault, protecting the DNA trapped inside from the ravages of heat, moisture, and microbial decay for millennia.
So they managed to crack this biological vault from the Rakagari skeletons. What exactly did the genetic data show?
The sequencing showed a direct, unbroken genetic continuity. The ancient DNA extracted from the Rakagari residents shares a profound and undeniable genetic link to modern populations living in India today.
Okay, we need to pause and carefully unpack the immense historical implication of this, because the source materials explicitly highlight how this specific data point resolves one of the most fiercely debated topics in history.
Yes.
We are talking about the Aryan invasion theory.
Right. The Aryan invasion or Aryan migration theory has been a cornerstone of historical debate for over a century.
Just to give a quick recap of that theory for the listener.
Sure. The traditional narrative, formulated largely by 19th century European scholars, posited that the original indigenous inhabitants of this civilization were suddenly invaded, conquered, or replaced by an outside nomadic group called the Aryans, who rode in from Central Asia on chariots around 1500 BCE, supposedly bringing the Sanskrit language and the Vedas with them.
The theory implies a violent rupture, a replacement of one people with another. Now, the sources highlight that this 2019 data prompts a complete rethinking of that historical timeline.
Exactly. The DNA data from Rakagari tells a story of continuity, not rupture. There's no sudden introduction of entirely new, dominant genetic haplogroups wiping out the old ones.
Right.
The research strongly suggests that the people who lived in the Saraswati cities are the direct ancestors of the people who live in the region today. The forces point out that this evidence indicates the civilization wasn't annihilated by foreign invaders, but rather it evolved organically from within.
So the implication from the research is that the people who composed the Rig Veda, who worshipped the Saraswati as a goddess, were indigenous to the geography they were writing about. It fundamentally recenters the narrative of Indian history from one of external conquest to one of profound internal continuity.
Right. But as clarifying as that DNA evidence is, it immediately raises a massive, terrifying question.
Right, because if the DNA continuity proves that an invading army didn't wipe these people out, if they weren't slaughtered by invaders, then what happened to them?
Exactly.
Why aren't millions of people still living in the massive metropolis of Rakagari today?
Because they had to leave. The archaeological record shows a clear period of massive deurbanization. They didn't die out, but they abandoned their massive, beautifully planned cities. They packed up and migrated.
But why? Human beings don't just abandon a perfectly functioning megalopolis.
No, they don't.
You don't walk away from covered drains, double-cropped fields, and a booming international trade economy unless you are absolutely forced to. They had survived and thrived for over 5,000 years. So what catastrophic event occurred around 2500 BCE that broke them?
It wasn't a war. It was a geographical betrayal. The Earth itself turned against them. To understand the collapse, we have to look at the massive tectonic forces operating beneath the subcontinent.
We are talking about plate tectonics.
Exactly. The Himalayan mountain range is one of the most seismically active regions on the planet. It was formed, and is still being pushed higher today, by the Indian tectonic plate violently smashing into the Eurasian plate.
Which means massive landscape-altering earthquakes.
Precisely. And the geological data indicates that around 2500 BCE, severe tectonic activity occurred along the fault lines of the Siwalik Hills, which is the outermost range of the Himalayas.
Okay.
This tectonic shifting caused a catastrophic change in the regional topography. The land literally tilted.
And water has to follow gravity.
Exactly. The Saraswati River was a massive, roaring force, but it didn't generate all that water itself. It relied on two massive glacial tributaries coming out of the mountains, the Yamuna and the Sutlej.
Oh, I see.
They were the lifeblood of the Saraswati.
But the earthquakes changed the tilt of the land.
Yes. This is a process geologists call river piracy or tectonic decapitation.
Wow, tectonic decapitation.
The shifting fault lines forced the Yamuna River to dramatically alter its course eastward, eventually merging into the Ganges River system. Simultaneously, the topography shifted in the west, forcing the Sutlej River to make a U-turn and flow westward, eventually joining the Indus system.
Tectonic decapitation. That phrase is chilling. It's like a modern, sprawling city suddenly having its massive primary water mains violently rerouted by an earthquake.
Exactly.
Imagine millions of people, a massive agricultural sector, international trade ports, and suddenly the water just stops. You go to the riverbank and the water is literally flowing 1,000 miles in the wrong direction.
And you can't fight it. You can't negotiate with the tectonic plate.
And without its two main glacial arteries, the Saraswati was doomed.
It was stripped of its glacial meltwater. Suddenly, it was no longer a perennial Mahanadi. It was reduced to relying solely on the seasonal monsoon rains.
And as if the earthquakes weren't enough, the climate decided to turn on them as well.
It was a brutal double blow. Paleoclimatologists have found that right around this same period, post-2500 BCE, a global climate shift occurred that significantly weakened the Indian monsoon system for centuries.
So they lost the ice water from the mountains, and then the sky stopped raining.
The river starved. The flow decreased drastically. The Saraswati, which once broke mountains, shrank into a sluggish stream.
That's heartbreaking.
Over centuries, that stream broke apart into a string of disconnected, stagnant pools. Without the massive volume of water to flush the system, the advancing sands of the Thar Desert began to choke the channels. The river was quite literally buried alive by the desert.
And as the river died, the agricultural surplus collapsed. Without the surplus, the cities couldn't feed their massive populations. The economy crumbled and the Great Migration began.
But here is where the story gets incredibly poetic and frankly spine-tingling.
Okay.
We started this entire investigation by looking at ancient texts. And it turns out the ancient texts actually recorded this terrifying climate apocalypse happening in real time.
You mean the Mahabharata?
Yes. While the Rig Veda describes the river in its roaring prime, the later epic, the Mahabharata, specifically a section called the Shalya Parva, documents the river in its death throes.
This is the section that details the pilgrimage of Balarama, the older brother of Krishna, right?
Exactly. Balarama takes a massive pilgrimage along the banks of the Saraswati. But the landscape he traverses is entirely different from the one in the Rig Veda.
Right.
He doesn't see an elephant smashing through a jungle. He watches the mighty river literally dry up and disappear into the desert sand.
And the text is shockingly specific, isn't it? It actually names the exact geographic location where the river finally vanished into the earth. It calls the place Vinasana.
And in Sanskrit, Vinasana literally translates to disappearance or destruction.
The accuracy of that is breathtaking. We usually treat epic poetry as pure mythology, just a collection of moral fables.
Right.
But the Mahabharata is functioning here as a precise geological timestamp. It names the location of the river's disappearance, and it documents the resulting mass migration of the people. And that textual account matches perfectly with the geological evidence of the tectonic shifts post-2500 BCE and the 2019 genetic data tracking the population movements.
The synthesis is flawless. The texts tell us where they went, too. As the water vanished at Vinasana, the population didn't just lay down and die.
No.
They utilized their resilience. They migrated eastward, heavily populating the fertile Ganga-Yamuna plains, and they migrated southward, deep into the Indian peninsula.
And that migration is really the key to understanding why this matters. The cities of Rakhigarhi and Kalibangan were abandoned to the sand, yes. But the civilization itself did not collapse. The hardware was destroyed, but the software survived.
Exactly. Their profound cultural software, their language, their peaceful traditions, their mastery of mathematics, their agricultural techniques, and their deep spiritual reverence for the goddess of knowledge. All of it was carried with them.
Wow.
It continued to evolve and deeply seeded the next phase of Indian history. It flows through the cultural veins of modern India today.
And incredibly, the physical story of the river might not be over either.
Right, the revival efforts.
Yeah, the research notes that right now, the Indian government, utilizing the very satellite data and geological mapping we've been discussing, is actively working on projects to revive the paleo channels.
Yeah.
They are trying to tap into that ancient underground water to bring life back to the arid regions of Rajasthan.
It is the ultimate testament to the enduring legacy of the Saraswati.
Yeah.
It began as a physical, roaring reality. As it dried up, it was immortalized into myth and poetry.
Yeah.
Thousands of years later, it became a groundbreaking scientific discovery. And now, it may become a physical reality once again.
So to wrap up this massive mind-bending deep dive, take a moment to appreciate the incredible cross-disciplinary journey we've just walked through with you.
It's a lot to take in.
We took ancient reverent chants from the Rig Veda about a goddess breaking mountains. We ran those chants through the microwave radar of ISRO and NASA satellites.
We did.
We validated them by measuring the radioactive decay of neodymium isotopes from the high Himalayas. We unlocked the biological vault of the petrous bone to extract ancient DNA. And through all of that rigorous science, we proved that a sprawling 10,000-year-old civilization of peaceful, mathematically brilliant people lived, thrived, and ultimately adapted when the Earth itself shifted and stole their water.
For anyone listening, the ultimate takeaway here is twofold. First, it should fundamentally change how we view ancient myths.
Definitely.
They aren't just fairy tales, they're often heavily encrypted geographical and historical databases. We just had to invent the scientific tools necessary to read them properly.
Right.
And second, it is a profound showcase of human resilience. It proves that a culture can survive, adapt, and preserve its identity even when its most vital, life-sustaining environment collapses into dust.
It really makes you wonder about our own hubris. We sit in our massive, technologically advanced concrete cities today, completely confident in our permanence. But if our modern climate shifts, or the tectonic plates beneath us decide to move, and our own major rivers run dry, forcing us to abandon everything we've built, what stories will our descendants tell about us 5,000 years from now? Will they remember us as peaceful builders who loved art and honest trade? Or will our sprawling cities just become another myth, a fable of a lost world, waiting patiently under the dirt for a future satellite to finally rediscover us? Keep learning, keep questioning the map, and we'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.